Good morning or good afternoon, depending on the time zone you are in. I would like to welcome you in the next section of this webinar on populism and constitutionalism on historical perspectives. And my name is Christos Papastylianos. I'm associate professor of public law in the University of Nicosia, and I would like to ask everybody to remain in in 20 minutes, because as I already said, our schedule for today is quite heavy, and I think that it would be difficult to arrange the whole issue about time if we do not respect the time limits. Now, I would like to thank you all for being part of this webinar, and also all the addresses and all the people who watch this webinar. And now the floor is on the first speaker, who is, in just a moment, Dr. Murat Erdoğan. Dr. Erdoğan, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers of this panel, and I would like to thank everyone who was very kind and very helpful in the whole process. And today, I will begin with a historical remark of Ottoman history, and in my presentation, I will argue that the Committee of Union and Progress, which is based in Thessaloniki and in power in the late Ottoman Empire time in 1908, between the 1908 and 1918, was the first populist political entity in Turkey. And from the beginning of the strife for power in 1908 to the fall in 1918, both in opposition and in power, in my view, the Committee of Union and Progress, acted as an anti-elitist but an authoritarian political entity. I will also argue that in many ways the Committee of Union and Progress was the mirror reflection of Greek, Bulgarian, Albanian, Serbian, and perhaps Italian counterparts of authoritarian populist entities at that time. And it was a symbol for reaction to the pressure from the New World Order, which is based on liberal views of Western constitutional democracies. I think, on the one hand, the Committee of Union and Progress has embraced such liberal values in Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, when they were in power, they struggled against these liberal views as well. So in order to enlighten my point, first, I will try to give a brief account of constitutional developments of the late Ottoman Empire era, and then I will try to make an assessment of such developments. And I would like to start with, of course, the first Turkish constitution. The first Turkish constitution, Kanun-i Esasi, was enacted in 1876 by the initiative of the bureaucracy with the purpose of self-strengthening of the state. However, the Sultan at that time, Abdülhamit, during the 1877 and 78 Ottoman-Russian warfare, with the excuse of the members of the parliament are collaborating with the Russians and Western allied forces, prorogued the parliament for an indefinite term, but this was de jure a prorogation, but de facto it was a dissolution of the parliament, since the parliament has not been assembled for another 30 years. Along with high-ranking bureaucrats, Sultan Abdülhamit ruled the empire with a classical Ottoman despotism in which there is no legal opposition. However, in that time, there was a growing middle ranking and junior officers, particularly in military forces, that has been organized to overthrow the Sultan, a committee, the Committee of Union and Progress. This committee has been found in 1889 in Istanbul Military School in Madison, and in a short time, the number of committee members increased and its influence on politics spread. And then, gradually, Thessaloniki became the center of the committee in where the military officers who are opposed to Sultan had gathered. So the growing bureaucracy throughout the empire in late 19th century soon became the most powerful opponent of the Sultan. And then in 1908, if you allow me, I would like to share my screen. In 1908, uprising in Balkans by the initiative of young military officers who are the members of the Committee of Union and Progress compelled the Sultan to reinstate the constitution. And this uprising was one of the most romantic uprisings in Ottoman history, which you can see the pictures here. The heroes of the revolution, Enver and Niyazi, are depicted breaking the chains of Lady Liberty, who is held up by the young Ottomans. Soon after the 1908 revolution, on the night of 12th April of 1909, an armed insurrection broke out in the capital in the name of restoration of Islam and Shariat. And in the early morning of 24 April, the Action Army, which had been encamped in Thessaloniki, and of course the center of the Committee of Union and Progress, and led by the Union and Progress Party, the Committee of Union and Progress, occupied Istanbul, the capital city, without encountering much resistance, and the revolution had been saved. Abdülhamid Sultan was deposed and succeeded by his younger brother Mehmet Reşat, and the bureaucracy under the control of the committee, which had failed 30 years before, did not make the same mistake, and the constitution has been amended in 1909. With 1909 constitutional amendments, there are three important points in that amendments. The first one is the political accountability of the Council of Ministers to the Chamber of Deputies was explicitly stipulated, as it should be in a parliamentary democracy. And then, second, Sultan's absolute veto power over the legislation enacted by Parliament was transformed into a relative veto power that could be overridden by a two-thirds majority of the Chamber of Deputies. And the third one, and I think the most important one, the Sultan's power to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies was restricted by adding the phrase Article 7, "Leder iktiza," if necessary. And then Article 35 has been amended as well, and the solution power of the Sultan had become very difficult. It could be only possible in the conditions of disagreement between the parliament and the cabinet. It follows from this, a constitutional system finally came into being, more or less similar to the constitutional monarchies of Western Europe. But the counter-revolution had shown up, the counter-revolution in 1909 had shown up the fragility of constitutional regime and the type of modernizing policies of committee stood for. In that sense, it was both a traumatic experience and a lesson that would not be forgotten by the Unionists. And afterwards, the opposition, which had been crushed in April 1909, slowly re-emerged in the following years. Between 1909 and 1911, a number of new parties were formed, and in November 1911, almost all the opposition groups and parties united in one new party, Hürriyet ve İtilaf Fırkası, Liberal Union in English. And 3 weeks after their foundation, and to the surprise of all concerned, they managed to win a by-election in Istanbul, defeating the committee candidate. Where the committee had relied on parliament as its main weapon to control the government, the palace and the bureaucracy since 1908, they now saw they were losing their grip on parliaments, and they had to engineer the parliament's dissolution. In accordance with the Article 35 of Turkish Constitution, Kanun Esasi, the parliament could only be dissolved under the conditions of any disagreement between the parliament and the government. There were three conditions for dissolution. The first one, if such a disagreement arises and if the parliament insists on its course, the cabinet will be renewed. Then, only under the condition of the disagreement continues after renewal of the cabinet, parliament could be dissolved only with the approval of the Senate. And third, in the event of dissolution, elections would have to take place within 3 months. In order to overcome constitutional challenges, the committee group in the parliament has proposed a constitutional amendment. It consists that in case of any disagreement, the cabinet would not have to be renewed. Instead, the proposal would be brought again before the parliament, and then if the disagreement continues, the Sultan, without having approval of the Senate, could dissolve the parliament in accordance with the amendment proposition. The proposition actually was a move to force the parliament to a snap election. If the amendment was to be accepted, the parliament would be dissolved. If rejected, the parliament would be dissolved as well. In order to prevent the inevitable outcome, the members of Liberal Union, the opposition, tried to obstruct the parliamentary debate by not participating in the sessions. However, the speaker, Ahmet Rıza Bey, announced that there is majority for the quorum and interpreted the opposition's action as disagreement between the parliament and the cabinet. And then the cabinet has been renewed the very same day, and the proposal was brought before the parliament again, and then the Sultan dissolved the parliament with the approval of the Senate in January 1912. This was a political coup against the opposition party, Liberal Union, carried out by Union and Progress Party. The elections that followed in the spring of 1912 are known in Turkish history as the Sopalı Seçim, elections with the stick, because of the violence and intimidation with which the committee made sure of its majority. And as a result, the new chamber was an obedient instrument of the committee, only a handful opposition candidates being elected, and it lacked any legitimacy in the eyes of the opposition, which now took extra parliamentary measures. In May 1912, they demanded the resignation of the government and threatened the armed intervention by a group called Halaskar Zabitan, savior officers, unless the committee complied. The unionist-dominated chamber gave the prime minister the vote of confidence, but Said Pasha, the old statesman, the prime minister, resigned anyway. So this was a government crisis. And then new government formed under the leadership of decorated war hero Gazi Ahmet Muhtar Pasha, who was not a committee sympathizer. On 25th of July 1912, the group of opposition issued an ultimatum demanding the dismissal of the Chamber of Deputies. The new independent prime minister seized the opportunity to ask the Senate, composed of officers and high-ranking officials appointed by the Sultan for life, to dismiss the Chamber of Deputies, and the Senate, approving of this civil coup against the committee, dismissed the chamber on 4th of August 1912. In that time, the chamber convened less than 4 months. And after this, the opposition actually now took the power from the Union and Progress Party. But growing unrest in Balkans in the meantime prevented the empire to hold a new election, and the government of Ahmet Muhtar Pasha and the succeeding one under Mehmet Kamil Pasha worked hard to crush the committee, but the state of emergency and panic surrounding the Balkan crisis of late 1912 provided an opportunity for the Committee of Union and Progress. In October 1912, Balkan wars had broke out, and Ahmet Muhtar Pasha cabinet even the army is unprepared for such a war, surprisingly declared war on Bulgaria and Serbia. His plan was to keep Greece out of the war for a little while, but Greece immediately joined the war. Ottoman armies have been defeated almost every front line of the war, and the empire's most crucial provinces, such as Thessaloniki and Manastiri, Bitola, have been lost to enemy forces just in a couple of weeks. And enemy forces, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Greek forces, reached the final Ottoman defense line at Çatalca, which is only 40 miles away from the capital city. Following such failures in the Balkans, the cabinet resigned and Mehmet Kamil Pasha has been appointed as prime minister. The new cabinet provided a temporary ceasefire between the parties and started to find a way for a peace agreement. But for the committee, the London Peace Conference gave it the chance to act not in the name of party political interests, but for patriotic reasons, since the great power proposals communicated the Porte, Babali, the center of Ottoman Empire, on January 17, 1913, included handing over the town of Edirne, which is one of the old capital cities of Ottoman Empire, an important city for Ottoman Empire, handing over the town of Edirne to the Bulgarians. It became clear that on 22 of January, that the government would give in to the great powers, and this was perhaps one of the most disappointing moments in Ottoman history. So the Unionists, the committee, had found a chance to struggle for power again. A group of Unionist officers, approximately 40 officers, rode to the Porte, Babali, the center of Ottoman Empire, burst into the room where the cabinet was in session, shot the war minister Nazım Pasha to death, and Nazım Pasha were cursing them at the moment, and took the members of cabinet prisoner, forcing Kamil Pasha, the prime minister, to resign, and a new cabinet was formed, and Mahmut Şevket Pasha returned as prime minister and war minister. You can see the reflections of this coup in journals. In this picture, you can see the officers of the Committee of Union and Progress shooting Nazım Pasha, who were cursing them at that time, and Nazım Pasha was shot dead. And after this coup d'etat, the Union and Progress Party had taken the power and never left it. So after this time, a single party rule was in power in the Ottoman Empire. In effect, the putsch of July 1912 marked the end of the Ottoman parliamentary experiment. The committee amended the constitution in 1914 and in 1916, resulting in removing all barriers to use the power to dissolve the parliament. Thereafter, the Committee of Union and Progress aggressively dragged the empire to the First World War and opened a pathway to a great defeat in the war, resulting, shrinking, and collapsing the empire. Soon after the defeat, the most influential names of the committee, Talat, Enver, and Cemal Pashas, fled the country. So between 1908 and 1918, the Union and Progress Party aggressively dragged the empire to a defeat, to a military defeat, and of course, dissolution and shrinking of the empire. The Committee of Union and Progress emerged, in my view, as a hybrid model of Greek and Balkanic secret and patriotic societies, and the charisma of the Sultan, which had made the imperial state seem like his personal domain, had been destroyed under the rule of Union and Progress Party, and it had been replaced by a populism consciously nurtured by the Unionists. I think in European South, when constitutional monarchies seek institutional international recognition for their revolutionary path to modernization, at least three levels can be identified. First, they worked through the international press. Second, they sought direct and indirect diplomatic support for their new regimes. And third, they participated in the transnational networks of secret and patriotic societies, joining other European liberals, especially in Spain and Greece, for example, in order to support their fight for liberty, independence, and constitutionalism. So I think it should come as no surprise that the struggle, particularly in Greece and other Balkan societies, to a great extent has influenced Turkish modernization through constitutionalism very deeply. On the international level, the committee was fighting liberal and libertarian forces of the Western countries. On domestic level, however, the committee was both fighting despotic and corrupt sultan and ethnic and religious minorities who were working to liberate themselves from the Ottoman Empire. Under such conditions, the committee's political activities has symbolized an anti-imperialist way. However, in order to stay power, the committee used authoritarian populism. And I think in political struggles, the constitutional tools were key instruments of the committee, both in opposition and in power, particularly the executive's authority to dissolve the parliament, which had been restricted in 1909 amendments and made subject to the approval of the Senate, has been brought back with the amendments in favor of the Union and Progress Party. And as my last words, that being said, I think for the first time in Turkish history, a political movement that claimed to be the sole true representatives of their peoples against the corrupt sultans has challenged the liberal international order and its constitutional form, liberal constitutional democracy. I believe such an authoritarian populism carried out by the committee was a Southern European response to Western liberal or libertarian forces and values. And I think if one takes a look closely, he can clearly observe that the spirit of such authoritarian populism, perhaps applying a little bit less radical means, still wandering through Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as in Turkey. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you very much also for remaining within the time limits. You gave us the historical perspective of how the notion of people has emerged in Turkish constitutional discourse, explaining also the peculiarities of Turkish case. And now let's proceed to the second panelist of this session, Dr. Bekir Keskin. Dr. Keskin, please proceed. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Can you see my slides?
I can see your slides.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. But well, yes, the day before yesterday, Akritas told us that we have 20 to 30 minutes, and my speech is closer to 30 minutes. But I'm happy to skip anything. I understand that we are short in time, but let's go. So the name of the title of my speech is A Tale of Two Populisms, the case of Turkish Republican Constitutionalism in the centenary. So it's also historical, but I'll also try to be analytical and share some insights with you. So my aim is to show you that how Turkish constitutional history is different than Western constitutional history and what that entails. Turkish constitutionalism is largely a trait of modernization project, and what populism meant in the late Ottoman period, my colleague talked a little bit about that, and during the Turkish War of Independence, and how the scope of the term populism changed in the early years of the Republic, and the reasons and the outcome of this. And I argue that one of the outcomes is the birth and entrenchment of authoritarian populism that we see today. So First, let me just make two remarks. The first is I use the word constitutionalism in wider sense. And the second is we also have two words for populism in Turkish. One is populism, and the other is halkçılık, which is basically the Turkish translation of the Latin-based word. But the thing is that populism has generally negative connotations, halkçılık generally positive connotations. For example, nobody would claim themselves in Turkey that they are populists, but they could say that they are halkçı. But I argue that we cannot make a distinction. They are one and the same, and to make that distinction is anachronistic or ideological. So I make no such distinction. When I say populism, I both mean halkçılık and populism in Turkish. So these are the conditions for the emergence of constitution, like historical Western liberal constitutions. Constitutionalism, we all know that, so I'm going to skip this part. And we all know that as well, that the emergence conditions are not the same as spread of constitution. But let's see what the situation is in Ottoman constitutionalism, historical wise. The Ottoman sociopolitical history doesn't have the same trajectory as Western Europe. There were no privileged estates, no segments of private property, and no bourgeois class to advance the cause. It doesn't mean that having no privileged estates doesn't mean that it wasn't an egalitarian society. There were privileged portions, but this was very different than what was in Europe. So there was no overcoming of estates and no corresponding rise of the bourgeoisie, which is one of the conditions for the birth of constitutions in the West. Instead, what we had in Ottoman Empire was emergence of Western educated bureaucracy and later military classes as proponents of the modernity project. And that project included having a constitutionalism. Very simplistically, basically, these bureaucrats and military classes and intellectuals went to Europe, Western society. They observed Western societies and came back, and they say that what do we have to do to prevent the collapse of the state? And we have to be more like the European states. They did all these and they became successful, so we have to follow their footsteps, and having a constitution is one of those steps. So I'm going to skip this part as well because of time issues. These are periods of Ottoman modernization, and I just want to talk about this picture because I like it very much. This is the guy on the left is Selim III, Sultan Selim III. Actually, modernization started with him. And the one on the right is Mahmud II. There is one more sultan in between them, but he was dethroned quickly, so it's not really important for us right now. But this is very stereotypically different, as you can see. This is very telling about Ottoman modernization project. As you can see on the left, the sultan wears a turban, he has prayer beads, and his cloth and sitting position is very oriental. But on the right, the sultan has a hat. It's a fez, but it's a hat, so it's Western. His beard is trimmed, his clothes are Western, and in his hand, instead of prayer beads, he's holding a piece of legislation and telling us that the Ottoman state is now governed by law. And he's also pointing, I'm guessing, to the West. So, again, my colleague talked about this as well, so I'm not going to go into detail, but the first constitutional period, the first constitution of the Ottoman Empire wasn't really a constitutional constitution. There was no limited government, the powers of the Sultan was largely intact, no separation of powers, and it didn't live long, the first constitutional period. But this is to me, this is the first instance of populism as democratization. 1.5 years after the proclamation of the constitution, as my colleague told you, that the lower chamber of the parliament was prorogued indefinitely, and even though still largely legally in effect, the constitution had no real application. And this term was named as istibdat period. Istibdat means despotism or oppression in Ottoman language, Ottoman Turkish. But mind you, the name was given by the contemporaries. So it was in 1878, in 1880s, the people of the Ottoman Empire, obviously educated class, named the term as an oppression period. What does that tell you? Just 2 years before, it was an absolute monarchy, and you only had a very brief experiment with constitutional ideas. But now going back to business as usual is unacceptable. They say that no, this means this despotism, this means oppression, so you cannot do that, or this is unacceptable. So it shows you that the constitutional ideas or popular ideas are penetrating the society right about the late 19th century. So again, second constitutional period was also, my colleague told about it, but I have to say something as well. So with the constitutional amendments of 1909, now we have a constitutional state. There is a parliamentary system of government, there is separation of powers, the Sultan's powers were limited, but again, no real application due to internal power struggles and constant wars. And I agree with my colleague that Committee of Union and Progress was populist, but I'm not very sure it is all negative. Why? First, the Committee of Union and Progress, they are revolutionary, modernist, authoritarian, definitely authoritarian, a clandestine, semi-militaristic organization. They refrained from ruling directly in the first years of the second constitutional period, even though they had a majority. But what we see at this point as well, that the members are generally from lower middle classes. Although they are not Republican, they are not sincerely loyal to the Sultan family. What they have in mind is a constitutional monarchy, like the UK of today and their day. So what about populism in the second constitutional period? There are a huge sway of newspapers. Up until 1908, there were only 3 newspapers published in Istanbul. In only 2 months, there were over 200. So formation of public opinion is something new, and this is deliberate. People are trying to convince the public for some political ideas. We see use of a simpler, plain language. So Ottoman Turkish and public Turkish or folk Turkish are getting different and different, or we recognize the difference, let's say. There are mass demonstrations. There's appeal to people, and although not found in any official documents, there is talk of national sovereignty for the first time in Turkish history. So what Committee of Union and Progress does is that because they are not elites, as I said before, they come from lower middle classes, they make this distinction between the people and Ottoman elites, people culture and West imperial culture, people's literature with imperial literature, and you can, like, people's cuisine and imperial cuisine, like the examples are endless. And their, let's say, semi-official magazine is called Halka Doğru, which means towards the people, and this is the first populist magazine published in Turkey. So at this point, to me, populism is largely a positive phenomenon. It means democratization, and when I say democratization, this is obviously relative, but before that, there was basically nothing, and now it's getting a base in society at large. So, end of World War I, CUP leaders fled the country. As we all know, the Sultan fills the vacuum and back to the de facto absolute monarchy, but now the Sultan has no political influence. His influence is only psychological, but it is also still important. The Sultan and imperial government is defeatist. They are very sincere, if you care. They say that they think that we lost, and if we want to survive, we have to do as told. So there should be no unrest, no nuisance. But in the meantime, even before Mustafa Kemal moved to Anatolia and officially started the war effort, as early as 1918, there were local congresses being held all over Anatolia. And these were in direct defiance to Sultan. This is also something new and an example of democratization. There is talk of resistance to occupation, self-determination, defense of rights, national will, popular sovereignty. And I have to say that still, like starting from late 19th century to early 20th century, the term nation is still not fixed. It can be interchangeable with people, and there are sometimes religious connotations, and etc. So again, this is another instance of popularization of politics. So in 15 May 1919, Greek occupation of Izmir, there are mass protests. This is a picture from the protest of occupation of Izmir. This is in Istanbul, Sultanahmet Square. And 4 days later, Mustafa Kemal reaches Anatolia and Turkish War of Independence kicks off officially. So the War of Independence is actually twofold. One is external and one is internal. Externally, obviously, liberation from foreign occupation, but internally, liberation from the Sultanate and the formation of a new modern secular nation state, a republic based on popular sovereignty. True, the second one is not manifested in the early years because there is an alliance of different factors in the war effort. So the second will be more manifest to the end of the struggle, let's say. In this regard, Mustafa Kemal's program of populism, Halkçılık Beyannamesi, is the precursor of the 1921 Constitution. And again, this is positively a piece of example of populism, but also it has real politic value as well, because program of populism also aimed to curb the influence of Bolshevism, because as you know, Soviet Union supported Turkish War of Independence to secure their southern border, and they also fished, let's say, for the possibility that if Turkey would be another Bolshevik state, but Kemalists were not keen on that, let's say. So that also may be one of the reasons that almost half of the articles of both program of populism and 1921 Constitution deals with local self-government, but which also couldn't find any application. But again, it speaks to at least in theoretical level popular participation, or injecting the idea of national will, people's will, to the constitutional discourse. So the opening of the Grand National Assembly and free elections. Before that, there were free elections in 1920, which always amazes me. It was very successful, the elections, when you think that there was occupation going on. Anyway, and the proclamation of the 1921 Constitution, these are largely products for the search of legitimacy, both against the Sultan's government and the foreign powers. I'm just going to read the first two articles because they are very symbolic. Article 1 says that sovereignty is vested in the nation without condition and reservation. The governmental system is based on the principle of self-determination and government by the people. This is a novelty in Ottoman and Turkish constitutionalism. And the second is also a novelty. Executive power and legislative responsibility is exercised by and concentrated in the hands of the Grand National Assembly, which is the sole and real representative of the nation. So national will, national sovereignty, these are the mottos of the War of Independence, and they quickly rose to sacred status. And at this point in history, this is a positive thing. This means democratization, because this is undermining the Sultan's power and absolute power. And first parliament is the most pluralist, first Republican parliament is the most pluralist and democratic parliament, unfortunately, probably ever. But the sacred status of these mottos will prove problematic and lay the foundations of authoritarian populism after the proclamation of the Republic, because then it will come to mean that majority vote is equal to national will. So a government elected by the majority can do whatever the hell they want, which is obviously not very constitutional. So, as such, Turkish Republican constitutionalism switched prevention of collapse of the Ottoman constitutionalism with a new foundation, but this is again not akin to Western liberal constitutionalism. The story is still different. As Firuz Ahmed observed, bourgeoisification in the Ottoman Empire grew somewhat stronger in World War I. This is ironic, like the most successful piece of bourgeoisification in Ottoman Empire was being realized in World War I. This is generally because the economic capitulations, bilateral trade agreements, but they are not bilateral by now, where the Ottoman Empire could only get rid of them with the start of the World War I. They always wanted to get rid of them, but never could under the threat of war by the Western powers. So that emerging bourgeoisie was the backbone of popular support for the Turkish War of Independence. So thus, when the war was won and Republic declared, the new state carried on the modernization effort of the Ottoman Young Turks and the CVP, but now with more resilience. And this meant, unfortunately, relegation of populism as democratization to the backseat. It was replaced with the effort of industrialization and culture building, i.e. the indoctrination of the new. And one of the most important things to say here is that the feeling and trauma of being late to the modernization business was a constant theme and fundamental in the Ottoman modernization in the psyche of the intellectuals and bureaucracy, and this carried on in the Republican era. Thus, the founders of the Republic felt that it was adamant to close the gap ASAP, and this meant a top-down Jacobinistic modernization. So this is strikingly different than what was the norm in the War of Independence. War of Independence, I argue, it was a grassroots movement, so bottom-up movement from the start. And the first parliament, as I said before, it was pluralistic and it was a scene of heated debates. Even when the Greek army came to the doorsteps of Ankara, there were still, like, let's say, a democratic debate going on in the parliament. But now, after the proclamation of the Republic, things are getting different. The trend is shifting. Now there is no more talk of local self-government, and the working slogan is entirely different. It's very enlightenment, despotic, let's say. It's for the people, against the people. So we know what's best for you, and we will force you to be this way. So the Republic sought to force, in almost a Rousseau-esque manner, sought to force the people to be modern and secular. This resulted in the continuation of the use of the word populism, but with a whole new meaning. Because to industrialize the new nation, the founders thought they had to rely and incentivize the emerging bourgeoisie. So the inequality among people was disregarded, workers' movements were suppressed, rights and freedoms were curtailed. There is no freedom of expression that we can talk about. And after the Republic, now there is another constitution, 1924 constitution. Even though it was written with a liberal multi-party state in mind, the Republic quickly found out that it was never going to reach her aims like that. So a single-party government with a single aim was formed. And starting from 1925, and especially after a failed attempt of a two-party system in 1930, the state became overly authoritarian. Even though the name of the ruling party is People's Party, and it changes to Republican People's Party shortly after, it never sought the support of the masses in this period. And still, populism is one of the 6 tenets of the Republic. It is official, but it now means something entirely different, an ideal uniform people with no class distinction, no class struggle, unified in a single aim. This is obviously unreal, not realistic. It had no connotations of popular participation or anything like that. There are people's houses, but they are founded to indoctrinate the people in the quest of the new. So, in fact, this is obviously not populism in any form. It's not authoritarian populism as well. But if you want to name it, because they name it as populism, we can say that it's populism without people. So, 1930s, or maybe I can skip this part, and if you have any questions, I can get into this. I think this is very interesting, but I'm going to skip for the time purposes. But basically, the Republican project relied on bourgeoisie, bureaucracy, and intellectuals. Now the people were completely alienated, and because they never sought the support of the masses, and for other reasons. So I believe here lies one of the main reasons of the at least partial failure of the Republican project. And 1930s were also the scene for a global economic crisis, and because Turkey wanted to industrialize so badly, it direly needed foreign capital, but there were no foreign investment at this time. So this meant that the Republican project also lost the support of the bourgeoisie. Now it's only bureaucracy and intellectuals. People were already eliminated. And when the multi-party system came to Turkey in 1946, the Republican People's Party held on to power in the first election because they had a snap election with no legal oversight and an overly majoritarian system that they designed for obviously their own purposes. But when the Democrat Party, named after its American namesake, having already capitalizing on the alienated people and the bourgeoisie, and they won the first free elections of the Republic when they also were able to persuade the bureaucracy. This is the set of tables. These are the 3 general elections of 1950s. And as you can see, the outcome of the majoritarian election system, the Democrat Party got 55% of the votes in the first election, but got 85% of the seats in parliament. And in 1954, they got 58% of the votes, but 93% of the seats. And in 1957, this is an early election, and they have 48% of the votes. And as you can see here, now they are in a downward fashion. Their popularity is fading. They lost 10% of the votes, and the difference between the two parties are getting narrower, but they still have 70% of the seats in parliament. So what does this mean? This means that this is another single party era. It can be a multi-party system now, but you don't have to talk to opposition at all, and this is basically what they did. Then came the military coup of 1960, and this is the end of actually my tale, because to me, the 1960 military coup was actually the last nail in the coffin in the birth and entrenchment of the right-wing or authoritarian populism in Turkey. Why? Let me explain that, and then I'll conclude with a few words for the AKP. So, DP was populist in its politics, but it was not really an outsider. They claimed that they were sincere followers of Atatürk and saw the Republican project, that the only difference between them and the RPP was that they were the better cook, following the same recipe. Their words, not mine. And even though it had absolute majority in the parliament, they never thought to change the constitution. They could easily, but they never did. All in all, they believed in a more lenient, trimmed down Republican project. But they too quickly became authoritarian. I say that the Turkish modern history is a vicious cycle. Like, this has all happened before, this will all happen again. And they quickly became authoritarian. As 1950s, as I said before, it was in effect another single party system, thanks to the election system and lack of a democratic culture. But as you can see here, there was a real possibility in the transfer of power again in 1960. The right-wing populism of Democrat Party was in downward fashion, it was fading, and there was another early elections called in 1960. So as you can see, there were going to be two early elections. So the things were not going in Democrat Party's ways. I'm not going to go into detail here, but if you want to, I can later on. But there came the coup in 1960, and the story changed dramatically because, first of all, the coup had no real public support, and the subsequent trial and hanging of the prime minister and two ministers made them heroes of democracy in public eye, where especially until after 1955 they were getting even more authoritarian, but now they are fallen heroes of democracy, and growing popularity of the RPP, the founding party, quickly faded. So the successors of the DP capitalized on this feeling to coup against the will of the nation, of the people. So this meant the entrenchment of the right-wing or authoritarian populism, where it was clearly, as I said, in a downward fashion. So what is the take of the tale? My last words. Sorry if I'm over the time. So from populism as democratization to populism without people to authoritarian populism. What does this tale tell us? What is the moral of the story? I'm sure my next colleague will talk about this even more, so I'm just gonna cut short. But I just want to share you this table. So this is another election system, again designed by the owners of the state, let's say, to prevent the other from winning. There's a 10% threshold, and in 2002, the first elections of Justice and Development Party, they got 66% of the seats in government with only 34% of the votes. Nearly 40% of the voters are not represented in the parliament. So these are some remarks about AKP. I can elaborate later on if you want. I'm just going to end here, and I'll say that liberal and Republican constitutionalists say that AKP destroyed the constitutional tradition of 100 years of Turkish modernization. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure that there was a tradition, at least a strong one, because it never took root, because the populism without people, with that, you can never take root of the constitutional institutions. AKP has dismantled these institutions because they were always weak in the first place. They were intact because nobody before wanted to dismantle them. So an AKP did so because it simply could. So now, next year, it's the centenary of the Republic, which is, again, coincides with another general election, and Turkish constitutionalism, that vicious cycle, is another crossroad. AKP's popularity is fading, but not as quick as you may expect, because here, I'll just say this. AKP relies on now a security-based divisive political discourse appealing to people's feelings, fears, and traumas with reference to an idealized good old distant past and a distorted, exaggerated, traumatic, oppressive near past, which is the Republican project. So this is a crossroad, and although the AKP's popularity is fading, it's not the ghosts of the past are still here. They are very skillful at that. So to me, the most important take from this tale is actually very simple. There is no democracy or no constitutionalization without the actual support of the people at large. And without such an undertaking, no matter how hard the task may be, because it was definitely hard for Turkish society, Turkish public, but no matter how hard, you have to undertake this task because there is no way out of the 150 years of the vicious cycle that is called Turkish constitutionalism otherwise. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry, I'm over time, and I'm happy to elaborate if there are any questions, and I hope I wasn't too fast.
Thank you very much. I think that you were more or less within the time limits. I would like to thank you for your presentation. What I found very interesting is the link between the link you made between modernization and constitutionalism. And if I understood well, modernization in Turkey was a project coming from upwards, and thus also constitutionalism is a project which comes from upwards, coming from upwards. The crucial question is whether or not such a model of constitutionalism fits to the notion of constitutional as we know it. I think that there are some similarities, but at the same time some differences. But at the same time, I think that this is the importance of such conferences and webinars, because we have the opportunity to deal with different models around the world and understand how complicated issues are, and and also presentations like those in this panel help us to think beyond the boxes we have in our heads sometimes. Thank you very much again. And now let's proceed to the third speaker of this session, Dr. Ilker Gökhan Sen. Please, now the floor is yours.
Hi, hello. Just let me share my screen. And yeah, first of all, thank you all of you for this panel, and also thank you to two of my colleagues preceding me, Murat and Bekir Keskin, who laid the historical background of what I'm trying to explain. First, I would like to highlight the catchwords and catchphrases that we always use, but I'm not going to recite all the encyclopedic knowledge, but I'm going to explain the keywords that I will use throughout this presentation. So first, I will use the word populism in its negative and pejorative sense. So it is Müller's conception and this triple conception. So as you can refer to Müller, or you can even refer to Roman Erodi yesterday's introductory speech, Popularis, as the uncontrolled and anti-constitutional, but also a-constitutional power of the masses. Turkish case fits in that framework very much. So I will stick to this Müller's conception when I say populism. So I don't use the word populism in its good sense, in its revolutionary sense, or in its sense for the people. It's against the people, but by the people. This is what I use when I say populism. For the populism that Oğuzhan and also Murat has already used the sense that they use. I will use the word popular. It's good populism or progressive populism. It is for the people, by the people. It's the ideal. This is the grassroots rebel formation. There is a Habermas way of intersubjective recognition of values and all the facts, and there is a very good, peaceful environment of debate, discussion, and there are also formal channels, constitutional channels of communication between up and down. So there is no from pure popular uprising, but there's also not any top-down elitist movement. There is a balance of popular demands and inclusiveness, and also there's a minority protection. Popular excludes majoritarianism in the sense that I will use. The third concept, which refers to Turkish history, is elitism and statism. So this is what Oğuzhan used in the populism, and the second part of Republican populism. It is for the people, despite the people. This is actually, even the word halkçılık that I will discuss a bit more later, the halkçılık in Turkish word, I think I have the belief that it's a mistranslation. It doesn't translate into populism. The halkçılık has a connotation of striving for the people, and it is a very arrogant and elitist approach. It emulates the Russian narodnik. So look at these stupid and poor peasants. Let's help them. Kind of halkçılık is that kind of populism. So it has nothing to do with populism in the bad sense, because they don't trust the people. They don't trust the movement of the people, and it has nothing to do with popular because it is an elitist, top-down, social engineering kind of way. So in order to have a stable power, it is by nature and majoritarian and exclusionary, because at times it has to legitimize itself, the elitism and statism. It legitimizes in both ways. It legitimizes in a meta-narrative to protect the state, but it also legitimizes up every now and then that the national sovereignty has revealed in the decision that there should be some controlled, or in the best sense, or rigged ballots or elections. So this is elitism. Overlapping with this, we also have in our history authoritarian constitutionalism. The term authoritarian constitutionalism has been coined mostly to explain the Cold War authoritarian regimes in Latin America, and it fits very well Turkey that followed a similar path during this time. So according to this concept, the politics is seen as an elite business. So this is a very good, useful device, a normative device for elitism and statism. There's a limited form of democracy because you need a limited, minimum legitimation and human rights protection, but the public is deterred from engaging in politics. So supreme interest of the state and society outweigh the individual freedoms. Order, security, and the stability of the political community is praised by a political rhetoric and action imbued with moral perfectionism and political elitism. So it is by nature an elitist conception. In Turkish case, we have authoritarian populism, but it is not the authoritarian populism that Oğuzhan used in his beautiful speech. What Oğuzhan said authoritarian populism, I call it elitism or statism. What I say authoritarian populism is a movement itself, and it aims to conquer and colonize the state by constantly referring to national will or popular legitimation. Having said this, we have three competing forces in Turkish constitutional history. So the first one is the populist right wing. So this is populist in the bad sense. So this is after 1950, where there are several parties. The first party was Democratic Party. Adnan Menderes was the leader, and the successor Justice Party, Süleyman Demirel, Motherland Party after 1980s, Turgut Özal, and Justice and Development Party today, which is known by his notorious leader, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. This is the populist in our Turkish constitutional context. The second force is the Republican Party, the CHP. This is the founding party of the Turkish Republic. So it has been blamed as being elitist throughout the history by this populist right wing. The third force is the army, deep state, or any extra constitutional state actor. So this we may turn it back to Union and Progress Party, which started initially as a popular movement, as a national, as a romantic nationalism, which emulated, as Murat underlined, which emulated the nationalist movements in Southern Europe, in Italy and in Balkans. This is, but then quickly turned into a very statist and elitist political power. So it became the state itself, particularly during the First World War, which was the reason of Turkish entry to the First World War, and also the many atrocities. It was also responsible for many atrocities that the Ottoman Empire did, and the Ottoman Empire was subjected to. So this is the main reason. This is it has a logic, but it is not always. It doesn't always act logically, but it has a certain kind of meta-narrative and logic. So this is, in practice, it is the army these days, because until 20 years at least, last 20 years before, because having the weapon to interfere in the politics in an extra constitutional manner, it is the most practical actor was the army. But there are many other structures in the state, and also there is a collective reflex of all Turkish people that may see these actions legitimate. So these are the three competing forces in history. So when we turn back to history, in the 1921 Constitution, also the panelist before me has explained it very well. This is the most popular constitution of Turkish history, because it was the constitution. It wasn't a constitution in its narrow sense, actually, because the Turkish state, Republic of Turkey, was in a nation state. There was the constitution of Ottoman Empire was still valid, and the Allied forces were, at least in the beginning, were looking to Istanbul rather than Ankara as the legitimate representative of Turkish state. So this 1921 constitution can be labeled as a manifesto of a popular movement in a very good sense of the word. Do you have a message? Okay, no. And it has all the revolutionary elements. This constitution was created in a revolutionary and popular manner, where all these grassroots local Congress governments pop all around the Anatolia and also the Western Thrace. There is in this constitution, there's a recognition of grassroots structure by a constitution. There was a highly decentralized government, and there was a decentralized and also democratic way of decision taking. So this is one of the popular constitutions in Turkish history, but it quickly turned into elitist conception. So this is what I was trying to say. What is generally translated as populists, the halkçılık is not populist, actually. So the legislative and executive power was vested in the assembly according to the 1924 constitution. But in practice, the CHP, the Republican Party, took control of the assembly and consolidated a one-party state. In fact, this constitution endorsed the natural law theory, which would be construed as protecting the human rights. But in practice, particularly because of lack of a constitutional court and party formation during this period, it gave way to one-party state and authoritarian regime. But still, it was not a populist one-party state. It was an elitist and statist one-party state. And CHP's 6 main principles that entered into constitution was 6 main principles. One of them was this halkçılık. And the other were revolutionarism, statism, nationalism, and secularity, etc. This was the main bastions of the new Turkish state. So this was all made a project as a top-down manner. So also the halkçılık was not taking any legitimacy from people or taking any movement from people, but to emancipate the people by elitists. And also the halkçılık in its practice was applied as a corporatist manner, because Kemalist halkçılık aimed at replacing classes with occupations, with professions, so that the nation could develop itself into a civilized nation. This is the main argument that the right-wing populists have been using this center and periphery device, the division. In 1950 was the first democratic elections, and this is the moment. This is the historical moment of the right-wing advent of the right-wing populism. This is the historical moment, as I use the word populism. This is the time where the populism entered into Turkey, in the sense Müller uses, or in the sense of Peronist movement. So, first, enough. This was the electoral slogan. Enough. The word belongs to the nation. There's one also. There's a side note here. The populists in Turkey never use the word people. They always use nation, because it is people connotes a leftist or elitist. Leftist in the sense that the more of the socialist movements call that for the people, and elitist in the sense that the CHP uses the word people. So they always use the word nation. It also has this underlining, this Islamic Ummah sort of community formation. So the nation is a very useful term in their theory and in their rhetoric. When we look at the Democrat Party's views, we can see that the parliamentary majority should have an unrestricted political power, and the separation of powers was harmful for implementing this national will. It's not people's will, again, underline, this is national's will that revealed in the ballot boxes, because of the Turkish society. This is it. This is the majority of Turkish society tend to give votes to those kind of parties, and these bare majority, these parties always use this bare majority with a abuse of national will theories, and they say that this is the national will. This is the absolute truth. This is 51% is the absolute truth, factually and normatively, for Turkish society. So it was this understanding of democracy that caused increasingly the authoritarian political conduct of the Democratic Party, which initially paved the way for military coup of 27 May. Just some examples of what are the authoritarian aspects of DP. DP was trying to take revenge from CHP. So what he did was, they have confiscated all the assets of CHP with a law, which was against the constitution of the time. There was also in 1960, the Populist Party created a committee of inquest in the parliament to scrutinize the activities of the CHP and to oppress the CHP. But in contrast to the statist and authoritarianism, the DP's authoritarianism was populist. So this is the difference between the two authoritarianism coming from history. The first authoritarianism comes from the Union and Progress Party, the creation of the state, protection of the state against the outside enemies. This is against Treaty of Sèvres. But here we have a different kind of authoritarianism. It is populist DP's authoritarianism. First, it aimed at perpetuating its ephemeral electoral success into an arbitrary power without the constraint of the constitution. So it conforms to populism as being a constant movement. It's not a rationalized or stable state, but it is a one of constituent power. It is always act as a constituent power, as revealing the national will. For this reason, it aimed at the conquest of the state, not for some sort of meta-narrative or nationalism, but just for these daily masculinist reasons and eradication of the preceding political order. And also, it was an anti-elitist, and politics of resentment has always been at play in the 50s as well as in today's Erdogan's Turkey. So these were the reasons of the military coup of 1960, these authoritarian aspects of the Democratic Party. But CHP's response was the declaration of first objectives. So we see in 1960 an alliance. If alliance would be too much of a strong word, but let's say complacency between military, the dark forces, and progressive secular forces in Turkish history. But this can emulate, or this was emulated maybe in Portugal. Transition to democracy, which also the military helped. But since the military was at play during that time, this 1960 movement and 1961 constitution has always been deemed as illegitimate constitution, despite all the popular content and all the popular claim it created in 1961. For example, the preamble reflects an euphoria of a revolution. So it has this very real popular constitution. There was an euphoria in the Hannah Arendt sense, or in progressive and in a good populism sense. The 1960 military coup was depicted as a revolution and an exercise of right of to resistance of Turkish nation having enjoyed freedom and fought for its rights and liberties throughout history. So freedom, revolution, and all these euphoria words were scattered around in the preamble. So several articles underlined the rule of law and supremacy of the constitution explicitly. And overall, this was a very, very good constitution, a very popular constitution in the sense that I've been using. So I've been 17, I have 3 more minutes, right? 3 more minutes. So the populist challenge.
Let's say 5. Let's say 5.
5, great. Thank you. The populist challenge against the 1961 constitution was initially became another source of resentment because it prioritized judicial independence and separation of powers by creating and empowering institutions of horizontal accountability. There were many institutions, autonomous institutions, that were outside the reach of the ephemeral political majorities, and these institutions were the powerful institutions that would create the politicization of Turkish society. Academia was completely free. The national broadcast authority was completely free in its working and in its activities, but it has always been a source of resentment by the right-wing parties, even after more than 50 years. When Erdoğan won the presidential elections in 2014, he said that 27th May 1960 parenthesis is finally closed. So I just checked yesterday, it's still in his Twitter account. So you can just go and check the 2014 Twitter, one of these tweets by Erdoğan. So this is today's also right-wing populists' resentment. This explains the resentments. So what were the reactions of this populist parties against this very good constitution? Despite it was bad, it was made in a very bad way. It was made in a very elitist and statist way. It was made by a military coup, but the content was very good. So. But still, the right wing was always against. First, this 1961 constitution's mixed and divided government and pluralism contravened the principle of national sovereignty. Particularly, the autonomous institutions hampered nations' direct use of sovereignty. Also, the constitution created several state institutions that did not have democratic legitimacy, and Chalcedonian Constitutional Court was the main target in that context, and still the main target by populist leaders. So all these arguments of hegemonic preservation of political constitutionalism were in the United States is very popular, but these were already in use since the 50s. So this resentment shows the Turkish populists' understanding of national sovereignty as the tyranny of contextual and ephemeral majorities of the right wing. Just after a decade in 1969, successor of Democrat Party, the Justice Party, reformulated these claims to make it more attractive to elitist forces. Now it was time that the national populist forces and the statist and elitist forces were making an alliance. It was on the path to 1980 military coup, and from 1970 to 1980, the constitution was amended to make it less popular and less democratic to meet the demands of populist right-wing parties, or vice versa, to meet the demands of the statist army, or they were in complacency with one another. So this time the alliance was between the populists and the military, as opposed to the alliance between the progressive forces and the military in the 1960s. So there is this 1982 constitution. I'm just going to say that it purely reflects a statist constitution. It purely reflects an authoritarian constitutionalism. So the 1982 constitution is not a popular constitution, and 1982 constitution is not a populist constitution because it opted for a political depolitization of the society in many of its articles. The civil society was was oppressed and stiffened. When the state and freedoms met, it was always it's always the state. I'm going to finish in 1 minute, but still there have been amendments to 1982 Constitution because there's two reasons: the internal dynamics, which we always do in Turkish constitutional law. The internal dynamics is the popular demands, that the democratic demands, and the external dynamics, it is the end of the Cold War, and the European Union was on the verge of expansion, and Turkey started this debate with the European Union. So there were many changes into the constitution that made it more popular. It was against this background, so I'm going to stop with the advent of AKP because we have already discussed it in detail last year. It was the advent of AKP and Erdoğan. So this is, as you can imagine, this background was from automatically given. I think the computer thought that I was preparing an advent calendar, but again, I didn't want to use any other visual input that can remind the AKP and Erdoğan, which we have been passing from a very dark time for Turkish history, because now we see again the alliance of right-wing populists and alliance of brutal deep state. That's why this is the main problems this is the reason of main problems of that the Turkish democracy and constitutional structure has been passing through. Thank you very much. This is all I can say for today. I hope you like it. I hope I didn't bore you a lot. I was the last person, so everybody try to. Yeah. I think you have a low blood sugar, but thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to thank you also for remaining within the time limits, and I would like to thank you also for this very interesting overview of the Turkish constitutional history, which shed light on the relationships between populism and constitutions in Turkey. And I think that your presentation gave us the opportunity to come along with some very interesting aspects of the Turkish constitutional history. Just a brief comment that I would like to add that what you mentioned, and it is very interesting, is that in the 1961 Constitution, in the preamble, there is a direct reference to the right of resistance. This is not a Turkish peculiarity, in fact. In Salazar's constitution in 1929 in Portugal, and also in another constitution after a coup d'etat in Ghana, which was formed by Lieutenant Rawlings, who seized the power by a coup d'etat, there are direct references to the right of the resistance. It seems that sometimes dictatorships try to legitimize their actions through a retrospective to legitimize their actions as a means of a right of resistance. And sometimes they do it they are trying to implement this right retrospectively in order to legitimize their actions at the present time. Thank you very much once more. And now let's proceed with any questions, or if somebody would like to add something more on what we just heard. So, Jason, okay.
Do I have the floor?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. They were really interesting, especially since, as we have told before, there is a lack of knowledge between Turkey and Greece. We don't know the history of each other, and so it's very useful to learn something new. So my question is addressed to all of you. It's not specific to one of you. So I understand that at the end of the Ottoman Empire, during its decline, there were, roughly speaking, two major responses to that. There was a, so to speak, pluralist one. I mean, something like Ottomanism, like equal rights for all minorities, all the millets, and so on. And the aggressive nationalist one, expressed by the Young Turks and, of course, by the rise of nationalism in other Balkan peoples. So my question is that, was there ever a populist movement, some actor in the historical scene that supported the assimilation and the homogenization of the nationalist project, but through a peaceful transformation? I mean, someone who was not liberal, he was not, they were not accepting pluralism in principle, but they were not willing to suppress every religious or other cultural difference in order to construct an ideal homogenized people, Turkish people in this project. So I don't know if I'm posing the question in the right fashion, but this is my aporia. Thank you very much.
Ifigeneia, now you have the floor, and I would kindly ask all the rest who are going to raise questions to make questions which are no longer than the responses.
Following
Ifigeneia.
Thank you. Following Jason's question, can we talk about a real liberal tendency in the beginning of the 20th century, or was it a modernized version of the Ottoman conception of power, first of all? And second, did the young Turkeys had a conception of, did they want to suppress liberties to construct the Turkish nation? Thank you.
Allan, you may have the floor too.
Thank you. Thank you for some great presentations, and my apologies for missing most of the first one due to computer problems. Okay. Anyway, my question regards the Turkish notion of the people. No, I won't try to. I guess you know what I'm thinking about, because I was, in a sense, a bit surprised that in Danish, at least, there are several different meanings of the equivalent folkelighed.
Can the other people mute, because we have sort of the sound going back and forth? So the people not speaking, can they mute?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, thank you. So I was a bit surprised in that you seem to be very, especially you, Ilker, seem to be very. You said there is one and only one meaning. It's not. It's like an elitist meaning, because in Danish it would be it could be constructed in many different ways. So I'd like to hear some reflections about that. And also to you, Ugutan, you said that to you this, if I got it right, this and populism was the same. So you use them interchangeably. And in some sense, I can follow that argument, but at least from the Danish, and I presume for Western political story, there's a lot of struggle going around about which we can see going on for or against populism in the parallel sense today. That it's good to be popular, as Ilker also said, and it's bad to be a populist. And I presume these political struggles about the naming and the meaning of what it means to be popular is significant in Turkish history as well. So I would like to hear some little reflections on that. And then more specifically to you, Ilker, you said this was really not, they didn't use the notion of the people, they used the notion of the nation, which triggers another question for me, that is, isn't there quite a huge difference between nationalism and populism? And you can definitely find populist movements arguing in terms of nationalism, but just to equate the two seems to be, at least somewhat problematic. Thank you.
Eleni, you may proceed.
Thank you. And thank you, all three of you, for these marvelous presentations, very informative of the Turkish constitutional history. I would like to ask us to expand a bit more on the what he described the single party era. How is this political system related to populism, as you described it? Because in Greece too, we have a single party era for many years. Thank you very much.
There is also a question in chat. Have you already seen it? A question addressed to the three of you. There is a question in chat. If there are no more questions, let's proceed with the answers. Who is going to start?
I can take the specific question from Anders, right? No, it was Allan. Sorry. First, the populism and the difference between the populism and popular. I'm not going to be that assertive here and just say that it is just a preference, because when you read all these literature, this is since the 61 conference in London School of Economics, everybody has their own definition of populism, and it's a very contextual matter. But what I can see from literature is, for example, mostly the American literature tends to use populism in any sense, like good populism, bad populism, socialism, and all the populism, revolutionarism, Hannah Arendt type of acting people together, because in the early history, all these social justice demands found themselves under the umbrella of populist parties or populist movements. They call themselves populists. And I think it's some sort of, here we have to deal and struggle with all these etymology and history. And at the end of the day, today, the literature says that there are two meanings of populism: the populism in general sense. You can add anything, good populism and bad populism. There's also a literature which says that populism means the right wing, and bad populism, which only takes the meaning, the horizon of meaning to the Peronist movement. So just using the people as legitimation. So I'm just referring to this literature, which is saying that, okay, now we are using it this way. So there is no way of assertiveness. This is not the facts written on the stone. And as to the second question, nation and nationalism, this is very important and good question, because in Turkey, we have two also nuances of nationalism. For example, it's also, for example, interesting for you to underline that if a leftist or a progressist wants to refer to nationalism, they use another word, the Turkish word for it. If a right-wing person refers to nationalism, they use mostly Arabic right word, because it also connotes the religious aspect of it. So from an elitist and statist point of view, when we say nationalism, it means the creation of formation of Turkish society as opposed to the Treaty of Sèvres. It is like that there was a post World War formation of Turkish society. This is the elitist nationalism. When it comes to populist right-wing nationalism or national will, it is the 100 years of resentment that the Islamist and Islamist movements have been oppressed by, starting from Union and Progress. This one, they refer to this nation. And also they refer to today's, they don't say people, they should say people, but when they say, they don't use the word people because of this leftist connotations, they use the nation as the electoral majority of today. So it is actually technically it's people, it's not nation. So this is two different, the two nuances between the elitist nationalism, which refers to the emancipation of the leftovers of Ottoman Empire and their protection, and populist nationalism, which refers to the religious version of it, more conservative and religious part of society, and also the daily electoral support. So this is the main differences. The other questions are not, I think, addressed to me because they talk about Murat and Oğuzhan has better place to answer them.
Yes, and if I may, I would like to answer some questions. Professor, can I proceed?
Yes, of course.
All right. First, I think Jason asked, are there any political movements in Turkish history who are not populists and at the same time, pardon me, who are populists, who are at least taking care of popular will, but they are not nationalists at the same time, if I understand it correctly.
Aggressively nationalist. They may want a national homogenized society as a goal, but they are not willing to suppress everyone else to achieve it. That's the point.
All right. Thank you very much. I think the Union and Progress Party at the beginning, they didn't intend to suppress the nation, but in times of political struggle, when they see that they are being challenged by the regional and local exigencies, they turned themselves into a more suppressive and perhaps statist manner. But I think even in Turkey, since the beginning of constitutional history, since the beginning of 20th century, there is relatively weak, but still a powerful tradition of socialism, actually. Starting from 1908, after the revolution, which I talked about, it was not only the Committee of Union and Progress flourished in political arena. Many political parties has been founded. So the Workers' Party and as far as I know, Communist Party later on were two of them. And even in the during the War of Independence, Mustafa Kemal and his friends, they were in Ankara and trying to build a new state. But at the same time, there was a strong socialist movement in Turkey, which has been supported by, at that time, of course, Soviet Russia. But when they tried to come to Turkey from the Black Sea, ironically, or let's say secretly, they say they have been assassinated and we don't know the perpetrators. Actually, of course, there are some guesses, there are some, let's say, imaginaries, but still we don't know who perpetrated such assassins. But I think the Union and Progress Party was not suppressive at the beginning of the political struggle. But when they find themselves in a political struggle, they turned into perhaps, let's say, Jacobins in French Revolution, right? They were like perhaps Robespierre. They were trying to take that pathway. Actually, they were the children of French Revolution, which is why they were anti-elitists, which is why they were fighting with the Sultan, with the corrupt Sultan. But of course, they find themselves in the center of perhaps authoritarian populism. That's the tale of Union and Progress Party, I think. But the more important one is that there is a strong tradition in Turkey, as far as I know, in Greece as well. For example, during Second World War, right? Socialist movements was the most powerful movements fighting against Hitler's army, right? So the resemblant entities, political entities, is present in Turkey as well. So there is a strong socialist tradition, but this tradition in its Turkish political history has not been supported, has not gained, let's say, a popular support, just as perhaps in Greece, but I think Greece is better. So I think socialists would be the best answer. I would say unionists, okay, they started as an anti-elitist, populist entity, let's say popular entity, but they turned themselves into an authoritarian populist entity, especially after 1913. So I think Ifigeneia, if I pronounce it correctly, if I don't, I'm so sorry. She asked about Young Turks, and I said, just like as I said, they were the Jacobins. She asked, are there any political movements in the late Ottoman Empire before the First World War, which is very interesting. In Republican era, starting from 1923, in Turkish Republic, we see a single party rule starting from 1923 to 1945, 1946, actually 1950. But after the revolution of Young Turks, there is a multi-party system. In the Ottoman Empire, there is a multi-party system, which makes possible to be foundation of liberal union. There are some other political parties, such as socialist, such as Workers' Party, the Socialist Party. So in that short time, starting from 1908 to 1913, in 5 years, we can talk about, I think we can talk about a multi-party system, but still we cannot talk about a strong, solid democratic tradition. So Young Turks were like Jacobins in French Revolution, whereas liberal union was more lenient towards the Girondins. We call it Girondins. I think I'm not sure if it's the right pronunciation, but they were like Girondins. They were like Danton, right? So the Union and Progress has started, let's say, a terror era, just like in the French Revolution. And Girondins was the opposition. Liberal Union in the Ottoman Empire was the opposition of this movement. But in contrast to Robespierre, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, perhaps these three could symbolize Robespierre in the Ottoman Empire era. They have succeeded to take the power in their hands, and they dragged the empire aggressively to its annihilation. So I hope that covers your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's proceed with the third speaker. Please take into account that we're 15 minutes behind the schedule, But of course, you have to respond in a way which is equal to the previous speakers.
Thank you, but you can stop me anytime you want to. I won't get offended. First, your question.
I'm not going to stop anybody.
No, I was just kidding. First, your question, because you said something very interesting, that the constitutionalism in Turkey, starting from the Ottoman times, is different than liberal constitutionalism, and whether it fits to that theoretical take, let's say. That's why I started from there. But we say, in general, because if you want to make that distinction as real constitutionalism and pseudo-constitutionalism, we'd say that Turkish constitutionalism is neither. It is not, because of the simple fact that it doesn't have the same sociopolitical trajectory. It cannot be what you would call real constitutionalism or whatever. But it is also not pseudo-constitutionalism because it didn't came from the top. Like the Sultan didn't wake up one day and say that I'll make a facade constitution and then it will all be business as usual. There was a basis, but it wasn't a bourgeois basis, or it wasn't coming from the society at large, but it was coming from a certain class, let's say, of bureaucrats, of Western educated people. And this is actually one of the reasons that, for example, Gökhan mentioned quite a few times of elitism. This is where it starts, because those ideas came from public, I would say, but a certain, like a narrow, educated part of the public. So I'd say there's still something there, let's say. So I think Murat answered a few general questions, and because of the time issues, I'm not gonna go over them. I'll just say that for the question that if there are different words for people in different languages, I mean, if you want to look at it, there are also different words in Turkish as well, but then you can also differentiate them, like people, masses. I mean, for example, in Turkish, there's ahali. I don't know how it would translate, but yeah, but then we generally use the word halk. But maybe more importantly, I think I stand my ground as that populism and halkçılık is the same, because the difference between popular and populism is generally, I would say, a liberal constitutional take, and to me it's a bit ideological, because in some sense they are not in the same axis. For example, popular sovereignty for the Turkish speakers, Gökhan, popular sovereignty is halk egemenliği, it's not halkçı egemenlik. The popular sovereignty is sovereignty of the people, it's not sovereignty of populists. So populism is very different than popular and halkçılık. And the populism that I tell you, the people that call themselves halkçı, I don't think you can translate it as anything else. That would, to me, as I said in my speech, that would be an ideological preference, and to me, an anachronistic one, because what I wanted to show you that the concept had different strengths in different contexts, and I try to explain you why. This is one of my main arguments, that we have to take into account the causes and effects of the changes in the society, in the sociopolitical history. But Gökhan said something true, that after a certain point, these are preferences. For example, Gökhan's speech is very classically liberal. His vocabulary, his understanding of Turkish constitutional history is very liberal, and I would say dominant view. But to me, and I know Gökhan is a terrific academic, but to me, it's an oversimplified, and it doesn't take into many historical accounts. It disregards many historical accounts. It is my stance, because to me, having like, for example, the automatic negation of populism, to me, I would say it's very undemocratic. To me, I would say that it's an oligarchic understanding of constitutionalism. And to me, Turkey is a very good example of that. For example, just as an example, and I won't take too much of your time, Gökhan keeps saying statist, but who in Turkish history is not statist? I mean, nobody. That's not a point of distinction. Or let's say, but if you want to understand causes, some people argue that, if you want to believe them or not, some people argue that they have democracy in mind and they want to educate people and so on and so forth. But I don't know how important it is. Like they are. I mean, anyway. But the thing is that, for example, in 1959, Gökhan said that, and this is a very important point, and I think if I can explain it just for a little bit, the things could be more clear. Gökhan said that in 1959 there were declaration of first objectives from the opposition. It is basically some proposed constitutional amendments, let's say it like that. For example, constitutional education, and etc., etc. And these were actually, so now you have RPP, the founders of the republic, in opposition, and they are advocating these changes, and Democrat Party, who is the governing party, disregards them. But I'd say that same story happened more than 10 years ago, and the roles were reversed. The founding party was the government party, and the EP was opposition, and maybe civil society. They claimed the same changes, but then the RPP, who was then the ruling party, disregarded them. So to me, there's a Turkish song which is nothing to do with politics, but it says, we are not innocents, none of us. It's even more poetic in Turkish. Masum değiliz hiçbirimiz. That is precisely, to me, the Turkish constitutional history. The roles change, but the approaches doesn't. So, so I don't know. I think there is, and I don't want to be critical of Gökhan, but I'm doing this for you, not to criticize Gökhan. But there is no people in Gökhan's account. He's saying that 1961 constitution is the most advanced constitution of Turkish history. Yes, in this sense. But what does 1961 constitution bring to Turkish constitutional history? Military tutelage for the first time ever. So, and that political tutelage is probably one of the biggest problems of Turkish history. And this is also one of the key points of success of AKP, because they advertised that they were fighting against that tutelage. But that came with 1961 constitution. 1961 constitution constitutionalized military as a constitutional, as a player in constitutional order. The only reason that there wasn't another coup in 1971 is because that military was already a player in the constitutional discourse, and they could just give a memorandum and change things. That 1961 constitution could only live for 10 years, because after 1971 it was changed drastically. Could only live 10 years. Why? It was the most popular, let's not say populist, but popular. It was the most popular, most democratic constitution of Turkey, but it didn't have public support. There wasn't people in any way for the preparation of it, or people was disregarded. Mümtaz Soysal, which is a very famous Turkish constitutionalist, wrote in 1960s, when the constitution was intact, wrote that he was very skeptical of the future success of the constitution, and he was proved right. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on and on. But last question.
Let me say something. I think that a response in a question should not be equivalent to a presentation.
Okay, sorry.
I would like, please, to proceed.
All right. Okay. My last remark would be for the question, the populism of the single party era. I tried to tell you that there are two single party eras. The first one is a single party system, and obviously automatically a single party government. And then, as I said, they use the word populism, but as I said, it is not populism. It's not even authoritarian populism. But if you want to name it, because that they name it as such, populism without people, that's what I said. But in the second era, after 1950, when there was a multi-party system, but because of the election system, the governing party got more than 80% of the seats in the parliament, only with 40 or 50% of the votes. Then there was a populism, an authoritarian populism, because Gökhan has also said, I also tried to say that because by that time, majority vote was equalized with national will, And when you had the majority in the parliament as a single governing party, then it meant that you got the consent of the people, so you can do whatever you want for the time being. So this second single party era could be a time for populism. So sorry if I extended my remarks, and thank you very much for listening.
Gökhan asked to respond to the comments. Okay.
Yeah, just 1 minute.
I would like to ask very warmly, both of you. We are late half an hour.
Okay, no problem. Just wanted to say thank you to Oğuzhan for his valuable comments, and some of them I agree, and I will take them into account. Some of them I don't agree, but we don't have time, so we don't have time to answer back. But thank you.
I'd very much like to hear what you'll say later on.
Afterwards, we can discuss. Yeah.
Okay. It is obvious that the break cannot be more than 1 hour because we're half an hour behind the schedule. I would like to thank you all for your presence here today. And now let's proceed to the next section if we want to have 1 hour break. Otherwise, I think that the break will be sooner, will be shorter.